All right, good evening. Looks like Steve says it's time to start. So I won't wait for the song to end and I'll just jump right in. My name's Liz Colby and I want to welcome you guys tonight. Tonight is going to be a really great Farminar. I looked through the presentation as always and had no changes, and I'm really excited to hear what they have to say to go along with their slides. Tonight we have Sophia Kruszewski and Kris Blanchard. And Chris is a consultant. His business is called Purple Pitchfork. You may know him also from Rock Springs Farm. And he's a consultant for farmers and farm businesses, and we love having him with us at Practical Farmers of Iowa. And Sophia is a policy specialist at the National Sustainable Agriculture Coalition, and she's a graduate of the University of Michigan and Vermont Law, and is really good at what she does, so I am looking forward to the combination of these two folks. Tonight we're talking about Food Safety Modernization Act and the implications for farmers. And first, I want to tell you a little bit about PFI, and sadly, not any more upcoming Farminars this year. This is the last one. Thanks for joining us, and you can see all of the archived Farminars on our website, so go check those out. And if you would like to see other Farminars next year, you should email us or check out the survey that Steve will send you later, and indicate what kind of topics you want and who you want to talk about them. Any ideas are great, and the more specific the better, because we will go and find exactly who you want and try to get them on here. So Practical Farmers of Iowa, if you're not familiar, is a farmer-led, member-driven nonprofit. We were founded in 1985 by field crop farmers looking at ridge-till, and have expanded since then to include 2,800 members who are field crop farmers, livestock, vegetables, and folks who don't farm, some of who want to eventually someday, and some who just like to eat food and support their neighbors. Our mission is strengthening farms and communities through farmer-led investigation and information sharing. Information sharing includes things like this Farminar, also a lot of field days, which the season is coming up, and we are close to finishing the planning for those. So watch your mailboxes for the field day guide, which is also available on our website in mid-May. We also have the annual conference, the newsletter, and the research is, all the research reports are available on our website, and those are all farmer-led and a whole lot of fun. If you'd like to get in on more of the action at Practical Farmers, you can join as a member. It's pretty inexpensive, $60 for everybody in your family or your whole farm, including your employees, which gets them great discounts to the annual conference, the newsletter delivered to your house. You can be on the email discussion lists, and a whole lot more. So think about that, and it's on our website, or you can always call the office and we'd be happy to talk to you. And we also have more events on our calendar on our website. Our events plus all the other interesting events around the Midwest and the country that we think you folks might be interested in, so check that out. There are a couple of rules for the Farminar. We reserve the last 30 minutes for questions, and you'll notice that your microphones are muted. And that's by design. There gets to be a lot of echoes if everybody's mics are on. So type your questions into the chat box on the left, and we'll keep track of them as we go, and then we'll answer those at the end. And we'd also love if you put your email address and your city in there. I think Steve put a note on there, but please, if you could provide us that information, we'd appreciate it. And again, the recordings of all the Farminars, including this one, are available on our website. So check those out. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Chris and Sophia. Take it away.
Thank you, Liz, and thank you all for joining us tonight to talk about the Food Safety Modernization Act, or FISMA. You know, in Washington, D.C., we have a bad reputation for speaking in acronyms, and so I'm going to do my very best to avoid acronyms except for FISMA. I'm going to be saying FISMA a lot throughout the presentation, so if you aren't already familiar with that acronym, you will be very soon. So before we do some introductions, just to give you a sense of where the presentation is headed today, we're going to do some big picture overview of FISMA. So where did the rules come from? Where are we in the process? Why does it matter? Some of you may be veterans in the process. Some of you may be very new to it, but we're going to start off with just sort of a basic big picture look at the FISMA rules. We'll spend some time talking about who is affected, so what types of farms and food businesses might be affected by the rules. We'll go into some specifics about the rules themselves and what they require, in their proposed stages, what has changed throughout the process and what they require. And then Chris in particular will really be able to talk about what those requirements actually mean on your farm. And then we'll talk a little bit about what happens next, so what to expect and keep an eye out for as the rules near finalization and start to be implemented. And like Liz mentioned, leaving plenty of time at the end for questions. So just to tell you a little bit quickly about the National Sustainable Agriculture Coalition. I know I said I'd avoid acronyms, but there's another one right there. We are an alliance of grassroots organizations. So we're an organization made up of organizations. We have over 100 member groups spread across the country, including PFI, Practical Farmers of Iowa. And we collectively advocate for federal policy reform in DC. So we draw on the strength of our grassroots and our farmer-based organizations to present a voice in DC that is in support of sustainable agriculture, of local and regional food systems, of natural resource conservation, and of vibrant rural communities. So we've been around doing that since 1988, and for the past 5 years, we've been focusing on FISMA at the legislative stage while it was being considered in Congress, and now during the rulemaking, to make sure that these rules, which at this point are looking pretty inevitable, are able to carry out the public health goals that they have while still being supportive of sustainable agriculture. So thanks again for all being here tonight, Sophia. And I will go over to Chris.
Hey,
So that's a picture of me. I'm Kris Blanchard. Just real quick, because it's not the most interesting thing in the world, but I did run my own farm for, or did I not put a picture of that? I ran my own farm here in Northeast Iowa for 15 years, had 10 years in agriculture before that. We were doing a fairly large operation, doing 200 CSA members, year-round production, selling up into the Twin Cities to the natural food stores, and doing farmers markets as well. So kind of knee-deep in all of that scaling up and selling to wholesale marketplaces kind of stuff that the Food Safety Modernization Act is really going to have an impact on. I stopped farming about a year and a half ago, and since that time I've been working on my my new business, Purple Pitchfork, which is my consulting and education company, and that's what I'm here representing, if you will. I don't know why all the pictures that people take of me have my bald spot or really funny expressions on my face, but that's how it comes out. I do want to just make a plug here that we did just launch the Farmer to Farmer podcast here at Purple Pitchfork, which is interviews with farmers. We haven't gotten any Iowans on there yet, but we've got people from the rest of the northern part of the country in there. But we've gotten some great reviews, and I just encourage everybody to listen to it and subscribe. And I promised Sophia that we'll get her back on once these rules are actually finalized.
Okay, so jumping into the meat of our presentation, starting with some big picture context about FISMA. So this was the first major overhaul that we've seen to federal food safety law since the 1930s. So for many who have been working on the public health side of things, they sort of have seen this as a very long time coming. And it was really triggered and began being debated in Congress in 2009 and 2010 following a series of foodborne illness outbreaks in different parts of the country that sort of rattled the public's confidence in our food supply and the safety of our food supply. So Congress began debating passing this major federal law in 2009 through 2010 until it was finally passed and then signed into law by the president in January of 2011. And what it does is give the Food and Drug Administration, the FDA, broad new powers to take a preventive approach to food safety rather than always responding after a foodborne illness outbreak occurs. So they're able to try to head things off at the outset by passing new rules that set standards for the way food is grown and produced and transported and imported into and around this country. And so the FISMA law directed FDA to put out 7 major rules, and we're just going to be focusing on 2 of them that have the greatest impact for farmers, the produce rule and the preventive controls rule, or the food facility rule. And so I just want to note that during the legislative phase, while this bill was being debated in Congress, there was a lot of work done by the agriculture community, by farmers, by advocates to make sure that Congress included protections in the law for local food and regional food systems, for conservation. They included language to make sure that the rules had to be flexible. They couldn't be one size fits all, that they be appropriate to the scale or the supply chain that a farmer might be working within, and that they not conflict with existing organic standards. And so what our job has been, now that the FISMA rule process is underway, is to make sure that these provisions that are in the law are reflected in the final rules themselves. So where are we in the process? What's going on? So FDA put out proposed rules for produce safety standards and for the preventive controls, the food facilities rule. They put those out in early 2013, and that comment period lasted for nearly a year. And during that time, FDA received tens of thousands of comments from concerned farmers, consumers, food businesses, organizations, because the rules were just that bad. And at the close of the comment period, FDA said, okay, we heard you, we get it, we need to make a lot of changes, and so we're going to reconsider some of these issues that kept being brought up to them about the impacts that these rules would have, particularly on small farms, small businesses, local and regional markets. And they said, we're going to put out revised versions of some of these rules so that you get a second shot at weighing in on them. And this is something that really rarely happens in the federal rulemaking process. Usually there's one proposal, you get one chance to comment, and then they put out a final rule and that's it. And so this really showed that the work of advocates and organizations and farmers that were aware of what was happening and took the time to weigh in really has greatly impacted the course that these rules are taking. So then in September of last year, FDA put out revised versions of some of the rules, portions of some of these rules that were related to the produce rule and the facilities rule. And that comment period ran through December of last year. And now we're in this period where FDA is considering all of the comments that they've received, and they are going through and they're making changes, hopefully. And they are under a court order. They were sued to stay on a tight timeline to finalize the rules by the end of this year. So the preventive controls rule is supposed to be finished by the end of August this year, and the produce rule is supposed to be finished by the end of October this year. So I don't think I need to spend too much time talking about why food safety matters. Those of you who are here tonight are here because you know that it matters. If you are in the business of growing food, making food for people to eat, you know that it matters. And so really what we're doing now is just trying to get the word out there, start doing some outreach, some education on what to expect, because these rules really do have the potential to impact how farmers and how food businesses grow and store and pack, process all their food. And so, it was really input from farmers, like I said, that helped FDA see the types of changes that needed to be made in these rules. And I think that kind of engagement is going to be really critical as we move through finalizing the rules and then implementing the rules as well. So again, thanks so much for being here. So let's focus on the produce rule first. We're going to spend most of the time talking about the produce rule, and then we'll switch gears and talk for a little bit about the food facilities rule. But primarily, we're going to be talking about the proposed produce rule. Now remember, these rules aren't finalized yet. So everything that we talk about, it's possible that this could change in the final rule. This isn't set in stone. This isn't law. And so keeping all of that in mind, what I hope that you think about whenever you think about something like a federal rule or regulation is ask yourself two questions. First, does this rule apply to me? And then the second question, if it does apply to me, to what extent does it apply to me? Because it's very possible that even if you fall under the category of the types of farms that could be subject to the produce rule based on your size or what you're doing, you might not be subject to the full requirements of the rule. So the produce rule applies to farms that are growing, harvesting, packing, and holding fruits and vegetables for people to eat. And if you fall within the category of farms that are covered completely by the rule, then there are a bunch of different standards that apply to your farm. But before we get into any of those specific standards, I want to focus on that first question. Does this rule apply to me? And so when you think about who might be covered under the rule, there are 4 ways that I find it helpful to break out how the rule might apply. So the first way is that you might be fully exempt from the rule. You're not covered at all. Based on your size or what you're doing, the rule doesn't apply to you. The second category is that you might be qualified exempt. You're not fully exempt, but you are eligible or subject to modified requirements under the rule, not the full requirements. The third category is that you are fully covered. You're held to the full requirements of the rule, but because of your size, you have more time to come into compliance with the rules. And then the final category is that you're fully covered by the rules and you don't get any special treatment. You just come into compliance with the rules at the set time. So breaking each of those ones out, you might be fully exempt from the rule, not covered by the rule, if you are growing produce that is not usually consumed raw. So FDA has put out a list in the proposed rule of produce that they assume or they have determined is not usually consumed raw. If that's what you're growing, if you're only growing pumpkins, then the rule wouldn't apply to you. If you're growing tomatoes, the rule would apply. Now that list isn't finalized. It also has drawn some heat from a number of different people. You know, one of the types of produce that was on the list of produce that isn't usually consumed raw is kale. And there are many people out there who are just gaga over raw kale salad these days. And so that was something that just drew a lot of attention, and it's very likely that FDA is going to be making changes to that rule or to that list of produce that is not usually consumed raw, just as something to keep in mind. The rule also doesn't apply to you if what you're growing is just produce for personal or on-farm consumption. If this is just your backyard garden, the rule doesn't apply. The rule also doesn't apply to you if you have $25,000 or less in produce sales annually. So if you have more than $25,000 a year in produce sales, the rule would apply to you. But if you have $25,000 or less, then the rule does not apply. So the second category, who is covered by the rule, is the qualified exemption. So you're not fully exempt, but you are qualified exempt. You get modified requirements, lessened requirements. This applies to produce that is destined for commercial processing. So if all the tomatoes that you grow get shipped off somewhere and turned into tomato sauce, canned tomatoes, then the produce rule wouldn't apply. Qualified exemptions also apply under what's called the Tester-Hagen Amendment. And so this is a protection that was in the law specifically for farmers that are primarily doing direct marketing. And so under this provision, if your average annual food sales are less than $500,000, so not just produce sales, but all the food that you're selling from your farm is less than $500,000, and you sell at least half of it directly to consumers or to a retail food establishment like a grocery store or a restaurant that's in your state or within 275 miles, then you don't have to follow the full produce rule. Instead, you're expected to provide your business name and contact information on a label or a sign at the point of sale. You are subject to record-keeping requirements as a qualified exempt farm to prove that you are below that sales threshold, or that at least half of your sales are direct to consumer. And you are also subject to provisions where your qualified exemption could be withdrawn under certain circumstances, and then you would have to come into full compliance with the rules. The next category are those businesses or farms that are covered by the rules completely, so you're not a qualified exempt farm, but you have extended time to come into compliance based on your size. So in general, if you have $500,000 or more in sales of produce, you get 2 years to come into compliance with the rules, and an extra 2 years to come into compliance with the water standard in the rule. Now, if you have less than $250,000 in produce sales, you're a very small business, and you get 4 years to come into compliance and an extra 2 for water. Small businesses have less than $500,000 in produce sales, and they get 3 years to come into compliance and 5 years for water. So based on your size, even if you're fully covered by the rules, you do have that extra time to come into compliance once the rules are final and they go into effect. So I'm going to pause there for a minute and let Chris take a turn and talk a little bit about record keeping.
And I want to talk about record keeping a little bit, because this is a lot of times for farmers, it's not so much the compliance, it's having to document the compliance that really seems to be the hang up. And like my friend Harriet Behar says about organic certification, if you don't write it down, it didn't happen. But I've also found, and my farm did go through a GAPS audit in 2010. We've been certified organic for years and years. What we want to do is to try to come up with ways to actually make the record keeping that we are required to do by these various entities actually do more for us, because a lot of times that can be a real leverage point. And so I always like to think a little bit about what record keeping is, which is that it's the process of summarizing, organizing, and analyzing data. And most important, I think, is when you do that process, you want to do it for you. A lot of the record keeping that's required by regulators, by auditors, is not necessarily actionable, and particularly in the way that it's oftentimes organized, it isn't actionable. So you want to think about how you can organize that information, how you can collect that information in ways that can actually benefit your farm. Don't organize it for your taxes. Don't organize it for the organic guys. Don't organize it for the inspector, because it's not their job to tell you what form you have to keep the records in, and it's not your job to keep it in a form that matches their needs to be able to walk on your farm and see at a glance exactly what you're doing. You can work at this from different angles. So that it's actually organized for you. And keeping in mind that and I think it's clear from the bend over backwards exercise that the FDA is doing, that rules like the FISMA, even rules like the organic certification standards and the GAPS standards are really not designed for us. They're designed for the large mega producers out in California and Arizona, who have a completely different business model from a diversified market farm in the upper Midwest. So we always want to think about making that record keeping easy enough to work, because if what you do is go and hang 40 different clipboards all around your packing shed and expect your staff to remember when they're supposed to write down what, I can guarantee that what you're going to end up with is a load of crap at the end of the season. So you really want to find ways to make your record keeping work for your staff. And the biggest thing that we found on my farm was to make the records be in line with the workflow. So and then we like to incorporate instructions into the records. It's oftentimes obvious. You'll have been to trainings like this, and I'm sure that by the time the FISMA is fully implemented, everybody will have been to dozens more trainings. When you look at a piece of paper that says, fill in this thing here, you're going to see and know what that means, making sure that you provide those kinds of reminders to your employees. These pictures are all of a harvest log that we used at Rock Spring Farm. We're always looking for ways, and I actually think this is missing the one where I said in line with the workflow. So this is a harvest log. We're actually we're tracking on this form. This is our plan. So it says we plan to harvest this product. This is how much we plan to harvest. And then we record as we harvest it how much we actually harvested. That becomes a harvest record. We record where we harvested it while we're standing there doing the harvest. So it's all part of the work. And then at the same time, we're using this. We've got the instructions on here. We've got places to take notes and request information. We have space in here to provide accountability, which isn't actually something that's so much required by the regulators, but is an example of how we're leveraging the fact that we have to keep these harvest records to make sure that we know who was involved in the harvest processes, so that if there's a problem or if things go exceptionally well, we have the ability to go back and follow up with those employees, creating that accountability. There's the slide that said it needs to be in line with the workflow. And you can see on here how I'm trying to grab the arrow, and I'm not getting the arrow. Okay, well, you can see up at the top here where it says the crop name, the goal, the actual amount, the field that we got out of, and then some additional information on there. The other thing that I'm always looking for with record keeping, and I was really tickled, I was just at a workshop yesterday in Central City, Iowa, where somebody had actually gone and was doing some records in their packing shed, and they had gone and purchased the Astro Brights pack of colors from colored paper from Staples, So we're always wanting to look and see if there's anything that we can do to make the record keeping a little bit fun, which is not normally what we think of about record keeping, but anything that you can do that can create the attractiveness to your staff and to yourself to make it so that it doesn't seem like an odious burden. And that's back to you, Sophia.
Yeah, and so I think that that's such important information to share, because if you do answer that first question, does this rule apply to me? And the answer is yes. And the second question is, how much does it apply to me? If the rule applies to you at all, there are going to be record-keeping requirements, whether you're qualified exempt or whether you're fully covered by the rule. The majority of what this rule requires is record keeping. A lot of the practices you might be doing already on your farm. It's really just a matter of having that record so that there's that traceability or that accountability, should something go wrong. That's what FISMA is really requiring. So getting into some of the standards themselves, one of the issues that was of greatest concern during the initial proposed rule were the standards for raw or untreated and treated manure, and when you could apply manure and compost to fields where you would be growing produce covered by the rule. And in the initial proposal, FDA had proposed to require for composted manure that you had to wait 45 days between applying compost and harvesting. And for raw manure, you had to wait 9 months between applying raw manure and harvesting. And they heard a lot from the agriculture, the sustainable agriculture, the organic agriculture community that, this would totally disrupt organic markets, that there wasn't the science to support this standard, that it was completely inflexible. And FDA heard that. And in the second draft, they got rid of the compost interval. So now as long as you're following approved composting processes, you can apply composted manure to produce fields, and there isn't any number of days that you have to wait between application and harvest, which is what is the same as the National Organic Program requires. For raw manure, FDA is saying, okay, you know what, you're right, we didn't have a lot of science for that. We're going to take the time to actually do the science and do the risk assessment and figure out what a good and a solid manure standard really should be. And so what they've proposed to do is defer to wait on finalizing an application interval for raw manure, and are instead going to take the next 5 to 10 years to do the research. And then at the end of that time, once they think they've got enough research to do a risk assessment, they'll repropose a new application interval for untreated manure that will then be open for public comment before a final interval is established. And so in the meantime, if you are organic, if you're certified organic, you're still expected to follow the National Organic Program application intervals. And it's very possible that FDA will put out an interim interval. So they'll say, you know what, it actually isn't very good public policy to say 0 days are required between applying raw manure to produce fields and then harvesting. So in the meantime, while we do this research, it's very possible that they're going to put out some sort of interim in the meantime, which is very likely to be very similar to the National Organic Program. We'll see when the final rule comes out what it truly is, but that's what's to be expected. So that's where things are on the manure and compost standards. So now we'll turn it over to Chris to talk about what that really means on your. You're up, Chris.
I think I had my microphone muted. I have to think about what I was just trying to say. So just a second. That flustered me. Okay, so the manure standard, I mean, the primary thing is this is going to be advanced common sense, right? You don't put raw manure on things that people are going to eat. Or if you're going to apply it to a field, you want to make sure you have plenty of time. The good news for us from an implementation standpoint is that actually best practices for manure applications in the north are very likely to comply with however the FISMA rule comes out. The biggest thing we're going to need to do here is to have records that say when we applied the manure and records that say when we harvested the crop. So if we've got those two things, which again, if you're an organic farmer, you're already required to have anyways, you're golden. You don't need another record that logs those things together on one piece of paper. What you need is something that says, I applied manure to field 5 in October, and I harvested radishes from field 5 in May. So now we've got a 7-month pre-harvest interval or an application interval between applying the manure and harvesting the radishes. And if that's long enough, then that satisfies. But you'll need both of those records. But you don't need to have all that on one piece of paper. The same thing's going to apply with compost. Really, composting comes down to record keeping. And I think anybody that's tried to comply with the NOP, the National Organic Program's composting requirements, they're pretty strict, and you do have to document the temperatures in your piles and the fact that those were turned. So that can all be, again, you don't have to have one log sheet for each pile necessarily. You can have a regular pattern of going out and taking the temperature and then recording an activity when you do turn that pile. You just have to have it documented. It doesn't all have to be on one fancy log sheet. And then I do finally, and Sophia, I actually want to ask you about this, and I'm a little worried about getting too wonky too early in the conversation here tonight. But the research is out there that shows, and it's actually an accepted practice with food safety audits in California in contaminated fields, when you use cover crops, that can actually reduce the survivability of foodborne pathogens in the soil. And it's been demonstrated in the research that organic soils, or at least biologically active soils, that reduce the survivability. They reduce how long populations of organisms like E. coli and Salmonella can survive in the soil. So in the original iteration of the rule, they had a provision that said if you can provide research that shows that your practice is achieving the same results as the practice that the FDA is asking for, then your practice is acceptable. Is that something that's still likely to be the case in the final iteration of the rule?
Yeah, so there are provisions that allow for alternative standards as long as you can provide, adequate scientific justification and data to support your alternative. And at this point, there aren't any guidelines for what is considered quote unquote adequate. And so there's definitely the burden is on the farmer to be able to support an alternative. But the rules do allow for alternatives. Now, at this point, there isn't, FDA is proposing to defer a standard. So, in the meantime, you could be doing whatever it is that you're doing, and there wouldn't be the FISMA standard. But I think what you'll be seeing in the next 5 to 10 years as FDA really starts looking at the science behind a lot of these questions, we're certainly going to be advocating that they consider these types of issues, biologically active soils, that they consider things like that as they're doing the research and as they're doing the risk assessment, and that maybe the outcome isn't that there's one suitable or appropriate interval, that everybody uses everywhere. Maybe there is some variability based on what you're doing or where you're located. And so it's possible that the research and the risk assessment that's going to be done will consider all of those factors. That's what FDA has said that they're intending to do is really consider where the manure comes from, where it's being used, what type of cropping system, what type of crop, all of those factors they want to consider in coming up with a final standard.
And of course, all of those things that may go into it are going to require, some form of record keeping. So again, if that's the case, if what Sophia just mentioned, that they're going to come out, so you're going to need to have a record that says this is where I got the manure from, and these were the practices that were followed on the farm where I sourced manure. Okay, and you're going to need some documentation of that, and again, the application dates. And again, even the practices that you're already following on your field. So kind of upping the game of the other farm record keeping that you're doing can help set the stage for you to potentially be able to meet a strict standard with not having to have as long of a manure application interval. And then with that, I'm going to hand it back to you, Sophia.
Okay, so now we're going to spend some time talking about the agricultural water standards in the produce rule. Now this is one that there was a lot of concern around this issue as well in the original proposed rule, and this is something that FDA took back and spent a lot more time on coming up with some alternatives or some revisions in this current draft. But I think that we're very likely to see additional significant changes to the water standard, at least as far as it relates to field use or irrigation use in the final rule. And so I don't want to get too weighted down in the weeds on the irrigation standard, just because I think it is likely to change. But what we wanted to do is break out the way you think about the water standard, whether it's used in the field for irrigation purposes or whether you're using it in the packing house for post-harvest activities. And so what FDA is proposing is that this standard for field use, for irrigation use, this standard applies if you're using water that is untreated surface water and it comes into direct contact with the harvestable portion of the crop. So if you're using, if you're pulling from a stream and you are spraying it, you're using overhead irrigation, then and it's going to come into contact with whatever it is that you're harvesting, then this standard is going to apply. If you're drawing from a stream and you're using drip irrigation and it's not going to come into contact with with your crop, then the standard wouldn't apply. There's still some question about what that means about something like drip irrigation on carrots. FDA's been hearing this a lot and they haven't given us a solid answer, but we're expecting they know that this is an issue that needs clarification, and so we're expecting to get some clarification from them on that in the final rule. But at this stage, what we know is that if you're using untreated surface water that is going to directly contact your crop, then this standard would apply. Now, FDA in the revised version is still using EPA's recreational water quality standard for the microbial water quality standard. This is based on the hazards posed by swimming, not by agricultural use, and they didn't listen to us the first time, and they're continuing to use EPA's standard. But what they've done in this revised version is instead of just setting a threshold and saying, if your water quality is above this threshold, you can't use it, now they're saying, if your water exceeds the threshold, you can still use it as long as you adjust your practices to account for the natural die-off of microbial pathogens that happen after you last apply water, after you last irrigate, and when you harvest. They're sort of acknowledging that environmental factors like UV light, like heat, like air temperature, all of those things play into what's happening with your water use and with any pathogens that might be in your water, and that they're not just going to persist forever on the surface of your crop. So they're saying that they're proposing a rate at which microbial pathogens die off between irrigation and harvest, and they're saying that every day, roughly 67% of microbial pathogens die off on the surface of the crop. And so if your water exceeds the threshold by X amount and you wait Y number of days, then you're good. And so I'm assuming that will remain in the final rule. we don't know for sure, but that's likely to remain. So it kind of gives a way to work with a water quality standard that isn't really created for agricultural purposes. So if this standard applies, then you all are also held to testing frequency requirements. So you have to be testing to see if your water exceeds the threshold or not. And so the original proposal included pretty drastic testing frequencies that were really burdensome. They were every week, essentially, during the growing season. FDA's modified that approach somewhat, which slightly reduces the overall testing frequency, but it's still fairly high. Now they're saying that they want you to establish a water quality profile by doing baseline testing over 2 years and 20 water samples to get a sense of what your water quality profile is like. And that way you can determine how many days you need to wait between using, applying untreated surface water and harvesting. And then you verify if your water quality profile is staying roughly the same every year. I'm not saying that this is the most sensible way of doing this. In fact, we've presented a lot of alternative approaches to FDA in our work. And so we're hopeful we'll see some changes because we recognize that this might not make a lot of sense to some of you out there, or it might still be a lot of water testing. And so we're hopeful to see some changes. But in the meantime, this is what we know about the rule. And so we'll turn it over to Chris to talk about what that looks like.
So again, this is specific to water that's being used for irrigation, regardless of where you're using the irrigation water. So you can't, this isn't this thing, water uses that would not apply in this situation would include dunking in the field. So if you, for example, harvest lettuce and then you've got a tank of water in the field where you're dunking that harvested lettuce, this water standard doesn't apply. That'll be the next section. This only applies really to irrigation water. So it's going to be important, obviously, if you have to test your water, to maintain those water test results, to have those in a place where you can be able to analyze and make some decisions about them. The ways in which we'll be able to do that water testing is a little bit, I think, a little bit sketchy right now. Actually, getting surface water tested is a fairly expensive proposition. Hopefully, there's going to be some assistance with that. Of course, having documentation about the source of your water, for most people, I think most farms, especially folks that are here in Iowa, it's not like you're irrigating out of multiple streams or multiple ponds. You've really got that. If you're using surface water for irrigation, you're going to be looking at one source of surface water. And again, I do want to point out here the top line on Sophia's slide here was we're talking about untreated surface water. So that really means streams, rivers, and ponds that you're irrigating out of without adding any kind of a sanitizer to them, which would be prohibitively expensive anyway. So we're really not going to go into that. So again, knowing the source of the water, tracking when you're doing that irrigation. If we're looking at a pre-harvest interval, so maybe, for example, you determine that on your farm, based on the test results that you got from the stream or the pond that you're irrigating out of, you need to have 6 days between overhead irrigation and harvest in order to get the appropriate reductions in pathogens, then you would need to track the times when you're irrigating and what sort of irrigation you're doing. So again, that would just be something that you could keep track of in a field log. I think most farmers are going to have a pretty good idea about, oh, right, we're going to harvest that field next week, we're going to stop irrigating it this week. But the trick is to get the documentation in place to say that that's actually what happened. So again, a harvest log with a field and a date, and an irrigation log with a field and a date, and the source and the method of application. One way to make those logs easier to keep track of then is, so if you're always overhead irrigating, you could just have an overhead irrigation log, for example. Or you could have check boxes where you could check off whether you were drip irrigating or overhead irrigating to make that data entry a little bit simpler. Obviously, again, drip irrigation, there's that. And then keeping in mind that this field water standard also will apply to spray water. Now, a lot of times when we're spraying for pests, we're spraying ahead, well ahead of harvest. But sometimes, especially with something like a Bacillus thuringiensis application in cabbage or broccoli, we might be spraying right pretty much up until the day of harvest. And in that case, you are going to need to follow those same standards that would apply for irrigation, because in this case, you're putting water directly onto those leaves.
So the second consideration, so that was the field water use. Now we're talking about post-harvest water use. This hasn't really changed in the revised draft. It stayed pretty much the same between the original proposal and now. The standard, the threshold is more strict for water that you're using, after harvest or during harvest and after harvest. And so that standard is that there's no detectable generic E. coli in the water. And if you're using treated water or municipal water sources, then there aren't any testing requirements that would go along with this, except, you're supposed to be monitoring the water and ensuring that it's checking the source, knowing the source, that the water quality, that you can assure that there's still, the water quality is still adequate for the purpose that you're using it for. The rule as it's written in the revised draft is saying that you can use untreated surface water in your packing operations as long as you apply a die-off rate between harvest and end of storage, so that the no detectable generic E. coli standard would apply. And if you were above that standard, you would have to apply a die-off rate, but they don't offer a die-off rate like they do for irrigation purposes. And so the burden is completely on the farmer to be able to, again, have adequate scientific justification to say, this is why I think it's okay, or why I can prove to you it's okay to use this untreated surface water, in my packing operation. So that's basically the bare bones.
I'd like to just jump in and just say, and keep in mind that it's one thing to put irrigation water on out in the presence of UV radiation and drying winds and high temperatures, and it's another thing to be taking that same water, having it on leaves that are being stored at 32 degrees in a tightly packed high humidity environment. You would have a completely different set of circumstances there. So it is important to keep in mind what Sophia was saying, that you'd have to have adequate scientific justification for a completely different set of circumstances. So
you want to keep going? Go for it. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So then the big thing here is obviously if you've got water that you're using in your packing shed, you're going to need to test that water on a regular basis. I suspect that the FDA will come out with a standard, Sophia, that says how often you're supposed to do that testing. Are we expecting to see guidance on that?
Yeah, I mean, they're basically saying that if it's treated or if it's municipal, then you probably don't have to test it. But then there's also some language that says you need to be able to provide adequate assurance that the water is safe and of adequate sanitary use. And so it's that kind of language, I think, that makes everyone uncomfortable and will really push for there to be additional guidance once the rule is finalized that'll explain what that really means.
So the current rule of thumb on this for well water is that you would test it quarterly. So what that means is, of course, you test it quarterly during the season that you're actually using it. So if you're only washing and packing produce May through October, you would take a water test right before you started that process. You'd take another water test in July, take another water test, say, at the end of September. Okay, and that would bracket you adequately. If you're still packing in the wintertime, you probably want to take a water test again in December. So setting up those quarterly patterns. And here with the water testing, the record keeping is really easy. You just need to keep the test results on file. So incorporating that into whatever your standard office organization is, so that you've got a file folder where you're keeping the test results, that's going to demonstrate that you've done the testing. And well water testing is actually pretty, it's pretty straightforward. What we found worked really well at Rock Spring Farm was to order the entire year's worth of test kits from University of Iowa all at once. And that way we simply had them in stock, and when the day showed up on the calendar that it was time to take that water test, we could take the water test. And that just kept it very simple for us.
And I should have said that for groundwater, so if it's a well, then the testing that FDA has proposed at this point would be 4 samples during the growing season for the first year, and then after that, just 1 annual verification as long as you're below the threshold. And so we'll see what that looks like in the final rule, but it sounds like so far the rule of thumb anyway is to do quarterly. And so that tends to align with what FDA is proposing for groundwater.
Thanks,
so
Sophia.
we're going to take just a little bit of time to talk about standards related to wild and domesticated animals. In the original proposal, there was a lot of concern that the way these standards were written could lead farmers or auditors or inspectors or buyers to push farmers towards removing conservation practices that they have on their farm that could attract wildlife into their fields. And so the rule in the revised draft now says specifically, nothing in these rules are intended to cause farmers to remove conservation practices like wildlife habitat, like riparian buffers. And so that's in there to send a message, that the intention behind this isn't to get out there and destroy any patches where, that might attract wildlife towards the field, and that the wildlife alone isn't necessarily the hazard, that the hazard results from, a lack of monitoring. And so what the standards require is that for wild animals, you are expected to monitor for evidence of animal intrusion. And if there is evidence of animal intrusion, which would presumably be fecal matter in the fields, then you're not to harvest some crop that's been visibly contaminated with fecal matter. For domesticated animals, the standard is a little more vague. FDA recognizes that you may have animals grazing in or around or near your produce fields. And if that is the case, FDA says that you have to wait an adequate period between grazing and harvest. And they haven't said what exactly adequate means. And so we would expect that to be clearer either in the final rule or through some of the guidance documents that would come out afterwards. But it's likely to be, somewhat closely aligned with the standard for the raw manure application interval. That's what FDA has kind of rested against to this point. So we're not sure what exactly that will look like in the final, since FDA is waiting on finalizing the manure standard. But this adequate period will likely need to be addressed either in the final or in educational materials that follow.
So this monitoring for wildlife intrusion is actually a really great opportunity, I think, for farmers to kind of up their management game. And this was a practice that we followed on our farm, and it's certainly something, as I've worked with other growers and talked with growers, the folks that take the time to do a weekly field walk, to really be in every field every week, observing what's going on. This is kind of the ninja move in farm management. That's a ninja. See, he's a ninja and he's got the hoe. So, but really taking the time to walk through the field. And again, if you can create a form that you're doing this, perhaps that includes something that says, hey, I inspected all of the fence lines while I was walking on my weekly field walk, and this is what I found. Checkbox for nothing, and then a place to observe any spots where there were issues of concern. You've now cracked that nut. And again, we've gained that extra benefit of incorporating a practice that we should have every week, in any case, of taking time every week to really engage in the management of our farms. The other thing that we did in our operation was this, and you can see down at the bottom of this form where it says I assessed. This is again the harvest sheet that I showed earlier in the talk today. There's a place to record the fact that my harvest crew leader assessed and identified potential sources of contamination in these fields prior to harvest and made the harvest crew aware of any necessary actions to avoid contamination. So, again, this would be the example of a deer walks through your field, it defecates, leaves a pile of droppings next to some of your lettuce, and you say, okay, on my farm, or according to the FDA standards, we've got to stay how many feet away from the deer poop when we're picking. this would be, again, that monitoring aspect for animal intrusion.
Okay, so now we're going to shift gears. We're going to move away from the produce rule toward the preventive controls rule and talk for the remainder of our time about that. Now, this rule, the preventive controls rule, applies to facilities that have to register with FDA. So if you're a facility that has to register with FDA, then the preventive controls rule applies to you. So what are facilities that have to register with FDA? Well, according to FDA, if you manufacture, process, pack, or hold food for human consumption, then you are a facility. And so the preventive controls rule, what it does is update good manufacturing practices and then also create a new system, a hazard analysis and risk-based preventive controls system, or HARPC system, for facilities to implement as part of the preventive controls requirement. So this includes things like writing a food safety plan, assessing potential hazards and points of entry for hazards in your operation, identifying corrective actions and verification measures, etc. Now, you might be thinking, but I'm a farm, I'm not a facility. And in general, farms are exempt from the facility registration requirement, which would mean you are exempt from complying with the preventive controls rule, except under certain circumstances. And so what I want to focus on is really when a farm might be considered a facility and therefore the preventive controls rule would apply. I've sort of broken out those two questions again. Am I covered by the rule? And if so, to what extent, for the preventive controls rule, into its 4 categories as well. You might be fully exempt, you might be partially exempt, you might be a qualified facility, you might be fully covered. But I'm not going to go into that too much here, except to point out that we've put together a flow chart that is intended to help farmers, food businesses, farmers who might not know if they're also facilities, with a way to walk through the different questions to ask yourself about your operation to get a sense of whether the rules, at least in their proposed stage, would apply to you. And so the website is there, and also in the box to the right of your screen on how to access that flow chart to get a sense of your particular operation. But the question I really want to focus on is, am I a farm or am I a facility under the preventive controls rule? So FDA has its own definition of what a farm is that may be different than your definition of what a farm is. And what FDA considers to be a farm, I have the definition up on the screen there. It's an establishment under one ownership in one general physical location devoted to the growing and harvesting of crops, animals, or both. That's the main definition. If you do those things, you are a farm. FDA also acknowledges that farms pack and hold raw agricultural products, that you may do drying or dehydrating of intact agricultural products. You might label or package them. If that's what you're doing on your farm without any additional processing, so you're not, slicing apples into rings and then drying them. You're just drying grapes into raisins, something like that. No additional processing is involved. Those are all farm activities, and you are not considered a facility. You are fine just going on as a farm. The produce rule might apply to your farm activities, but the facility rule does not. In the original proposal, FDA had made some differences between whether you were doing packing and holding activities on yours or another farm's fruits and vegetables or raw agricultural products. So if you were getting blueberries from a neighbor or some other crop from a neighbor, and you were packing and holding that on your farm and putting it out with a CSA or just otherwise aggregating produce from a few different farms, you would have triggered the facility definition, and the preventive controls rule would have applied. That is changed now. FDA heard that loud and clear, that didn't make any sense. That wasn't a risk-based distinction, and they've changed their approach to that. So now it doesn't matter if it's your produce or someone else's produce, as long as it's happening on your farm, then you're still a farm. The packing and holding definitions have also been expanded to acknowledge that there are incidental activities that are necessary for packing and holding, that just because you're doing them doesn't make you a facility. So if part of packing and holding includes washing, but you're not chopping and washing, you're just washing so you can pack and hold, then that's still a farm activity. That's not a facility activity. So there have been some improvements made to the definition to try to avoid the result of farms being improperly considered facilities. But there are still problems with the definition. I sort of ticked them off on the screen there. You know, this idea that a farm is just in one general physical location or is under one single ownership, or that somehow if you're packing and holding off of your farm instead of on your farm, a different rule should apply. All of those issues remain to be addressed in the final rule, and we're not quite sure how FDA is going to come down on them. And so that's going to be an area where if you are, you know, on the line, then you'll want to make sure to stay tuned and see how this plays out. And then if you are a farm that's doing manufacturing and processing, you know, if you're chopping, if you're peeling, if you're baking, if you're freezing, then the preventive controls rule might apply to you. But again, keep in mind that it might not apply in its full extent, or there might be other exemptions for you if you sell, you know, direct to consumer, or if you're, you know, under a sales size. So there are those considerations for small operations as well. So in just another minute, just to wrap up here, and then we'll open it up for questions, just keep in mind, you know, again, these rules aren't final yet. They are expected to be finalized this year, but they aren't final yet. And so, you know, stay tuned for the final rules and the materials that'll start coming out after that, explaining them. And also keep in mind, you know, that even if you are subject to the rules, and many farmers and small businesses will not be subject to the full weight of the rules, even if you are, there are extended compliance times, you know, before you're expected to be fully in compliant with the rule, depending on the size of your farm. So just keep all of that in mind. And also that, you know, as the rules are finalized, groups like NSAC, groups like PFI, USDA, businesses, there's going to be a lot of information coming out to help explain what the rules really mean on your farm and what you're expected to do. So there's a lot to be done in that area. And just again, to remind you of the value of staying engaged on this issue. It was really farmers and concerned citizens who submitted comments on the proposals in their first two stages that have had the biggest impact on FDA's thinking on this issue. And so I encourage you to stay engaged, and thanks again, and we're ready for questions.
Hey, I want to jump in and say something about Sophia's work on this project, because I spent a fair amount of time, nothing close to what I know that Sophia has spent with this, engaging with the rule. And I mean, this is like, I mean, brain deadening activity trying to draw this together. And I was actually, even just listening to Sophia talk, having sort of these flashbacks to trying to understand what was in the rule well enough to even be able to make something that resembled an intelligent comment about it. And I want to comment on just how much hard work has been put in. And really, I think the great the great work that NSAC has done, the National Sustainable Agriculture Coalition, Sophia's organization, in not only doing the advocating work, but providing the information and resources that the rest of us needed in order to be able to be good advocates on our own behalf. So thank you so much, Sophia and NSAC, for doing that work.
Oh, thank you.
Here. And why don't we go ahead and look at David's question there first.
Oh gosh. So the question is, if I have beehives at multiple locations spread across the country, but I process the honey at one site, do I qualify as a farm? So, you know, I'm going to have to double check on this, but I am pretty sure, so you would be a farm, but you wouldn't be a facility, I don't think. I'm pretty sure that harvesting honey and processing honey, let me just double check something real quick here. I'm just trying to understand if the question has to do with honey, or does the question have to do with the fact that you have multiple locations? If David, if you can type in a clarification.
Would this even apply in this situation because it's honey, it's not subject to the produce rule?
myself. Right, so honey would not be subject to the produce rule, but the question is, would the operation be subject to the facility rule as a food processing facility? And so if the farm has multiple locations, but it's all processed at one site, does it trigger the facility definition, or is it protected? You know, is it exempt from the facility registration requirement as a farm? And so I think that the multiple locations piece wouldn't affect, in this situation, it probably wouldn't affect whether or not it's considered a farm. I think that it would probably still be considered a farm, but I think that it might trigger the facility definition. The issue is that, so in this particular context, you would likely be considered a food facility. You might have to register with FDA, but you would be held to a lighter standard. You probably wouldn't have to comply with the full HARP-C requirements. You'd be exempt because I believe that processing honey is considered a low-risk processing activity. And so as long as it's happening on your farm, then you aren't covered by the facilities rule. Now, again, you know, everybody's situation is different, and so there are a lot of contingencies that are involved in that. But I would encourage you to take a look at the flow chart, and that's helpful in answering some of those questions, particularly based on your size. But I think that you would be considered a farm, but you might be a farm mixed type facility, which is subject to the preventive controls rule. I hope that's helpful. I know that it's hard with everyone's situation is so individualized, and so it's hard to provide really concrete answers to highly individualized questions, but I will do my best.
Well, and I suspect that as the rule is actually published, we should, I would expect that, like the honey or the beekeepers associations, I mean, this has got to be a pretty common circumstance for them, and they're probably going to be doing some interpretation on that.
Mm-hmm.
So let's go ahead and take.
I see a question now. Oh,
go ahead, Tom and Kathy's question. Go ahead, Sophia.
Okay, so the question is, how do the FISMA regulations relate to good agricultural practices or GAPs? They've just completed a GAP training, and the FISMA regulations seem less strict than GAP. So that's a really good question. And what's happening now, I'm assuming that this is that you've maybe done a USDA GAPS program. You know, there are a few different kinds of GAPS programs, but there are areas where FISMA may be less strict than what GAPs are currently set at. There are areas where they may be more strict. And so, you know, because we're still in the draft stages, we can't make any concrete determinations about which is more or less strict. But what's happening now is that USDA and FDA are working together to make sure that the GAP program aligns with what FISMA requires. And what we've heard from USDA is that where the GAP program is more strict than the FISMA rules, it's likely to stay more strict. They're not going to lower their standards for FISMA, but where their standards aren't as strict as FISMA, they're going to bring them up to meet FISMA. So FISMA kind of sets a bar, and then GAPs could build up from there. And so that's likely what you'll see with GAP programs, is that if there's, you know, it's possible that they'll just go straight to aligning with whatever it is that FISMA requires, but I think it's more likely that they'll stay more strict where they are more strict, but then really be looking at those areas where maybe they're lower than the FISMA bar.
And I guess keep in mind that when people use the word GAP, it's not a very precise word to use about food safety. GAPs are in general they're good agricultural practices. They're the kinds of things that you should be doing. But there's the USDA GAPS audit, and in fact the USDA currently offers 2 different GAPS audits that audit to different standards. They have their standard audit verification checklist that you can use, or they have the harmonized GAPS audit, which is a slightly higher standard. There are other auditing firms that audit to different standards. So if you get an audit by Primus, you're likely to be held to a, well, not likely to, you will be held to a higher standard. It's still considered a GAPS audit, but they have a higher or different standard than what the USDA has. So it's important, I think, to understand GAPS, the distinction between good agricultural practices as a concept, in other words, how to keep your food safe and the various ways that you can reduce risk, as opposed to the FISMA, the Food Safety Modernization Act, which is going to be a set of regulations, which means they're the law, which means that you got to do what the law says, versus getting a GAPS audit, which is a voluntary process that your customers may require you to do in order to be able to sell to them, and which may or may not have the same standards as the FISMA, and indeed where those standards may vary between different auditing organizations. It's very much like the Wild West of organic certification back in the 1990s before we had the National Organic Program in place.
Well, Sam is working on his question. I've got a question. Sophia, what do you think is the most commonly misunderstood part of this regulation?
That's a great question. The most commonly misunderstood. I mean, I think that the most confusing aspect in large part continues to be the gray area between when a farm is also a facility. I think that that's an area that still needs a lot of clarification and a real ability to take a look at, everything that you're doing on your farm and determining if you might be entering into that gray area of something that could be a facility activity. And so I think that that's going to be a very complicated part of these rules to implement, more on FDA's side than on the farm side. I think that in terms of the produce rule, things that we've been talking about, a lot of these practices, I liked the way that Chris put it. It's like heightened common sense or enhanced common sense. It's stuff that a lot of farmers are doing anyway. And so the big focus is just on keeping good records. And that's sort of, in that way, when FDA does implementation for the produce rule, it would just be a lot of like checking of records. But in terms of determining whether a farm is also a facility, I think that presents a different kind of challenge than some of the other components of the rules present.
Great. And
I mean, I
think
think
do you want to look at
that? Oh, sorry. I was just going to add that, part of my job is trying to figure out what parts of the rules are confusing for folks that would be covered by them, and then being able to translate that information back to FDA to be able to get this kind of clarification that we need. And so, to the extent that there are things that are confusing that you're bringing up in these questions, all of you who are on the webinar, this is really helpful for my work so that I can then bring it back to FDA and try to get answers.
And do you want to take a look at Sam's question there? The primary focus of the produce safety seems to be focused on manure use. Products such as fish emulsion, blood meal, and microbial non-manure-based sprays addressed, or is it primarily manure that is the concern?
That's a really good question. And so, I've been referring to the standard as a manure standard, but officially it's a standard that's related to biological soil amendments of animal origin. And so any soil amendment that has animal parts in it. So that would include things like fish emulsion. And so to the extent that you're using biological soil amendments that contain animal parts in them, the rules would apply either as an untreated or as a treated or composted soil amendment. So manure, I think, is the primary concern, but the rule applies equally to manure and non-manure based soil amendments of animal origin.
So, Sophia,
worms
part of
tend to
what I
fly.
think.
Go ahead, Chris.
Sophia, part of what I think you're getting at there is that If a product like blood meal, I mean, it's one thing if what you're doing is applying raw blood to your field, that's a raw product. But if that's actually been heat treated in such a way that it would kill the bacteria and the viruses that might cause somebody to get sick, then that wouldn't be treated as raw manure under the regulation.
Right, right. It would be considered a treated biological soil amendment. You know, same as like if you're just putting raw fish out on your fields, I suppose, versus a fish emulsion, presumably. Or maybe fish
If you put raw fish on your field, it's going to smell bad.
And Sophia, worms and worm castings tend to fly under the radar of animal products. Have they been addressed in these standards?
Gosh, no, I don't think that that's an issue that's really risen to the level of things that FDA is directly calling out in the rule that I can recall. I mean, I would assume that worm products are still worm castings compared to worms, though, right? But I mean, it's still a biological soil amendment of animal origin. So I would assume that an FDA's kind of black and white view of it, they would lump it with you know, whether it's treated or untreated. But again, this is an issue that hopefully all of these, you know, something that we've been doing is advocating to FDA that they can't necessarily just consider things so black and white, and that there is this gray area, and that as they do their research and they do their risk assessment, they take into account products that fall into some of those grayer areas.
I have another question while people are working on theirs in the chat box. So you were talking about the water and see, where did my question go? Oh, I wondered if the presence of E. coli in surface waters, if you had to make adjustments for that on your farm, if there were any implications for water regulations in agriculture more broadly in terms of E. coli source.
I'm sorry, could you repeat that one more time?
So we have a lot of water quality issues in Iowa, as you probably know. And so if you were using surface waters that tested positive for E. coli and had to adjust your management practices to account for that, do you think that there would be implications for water regulation and agriculture upstream? And has anyone been discussing that?
Yeah, that's a very good question, and something that we have been bringing up, just in the sense that, you know, the way the rules are written, they certainly do place the burden of dealing with water quality issues on the farmer who's using the water, whether or not they're the source of the problem. And so I think that that's a very important issue to raise. I don't think it's anything that FDA is interested in getting involved in, for better or for worse. And so, you know, maybe down the line it would be able to help provide more information about where water quality issues are occurring. But I don't think that we're going to see, you know, FDA working with EPA or of their own accord trying to make changes to water quality based on these rules.
Can you hear me?
Sophia, I've got Sophia,
Go ahead,
I've got
Chris.
a couple of questions for you. Yeah. Are the dollar limits that apply to the various exemptions, are those subject to inflation, or are those hard coded into the law the way the organics certification exemption is? You know, that was where they said $5,000 in 1990. And I happen to know $5,000 in 1990 was a whale of a lot more rutabagas then than it is now.
Yeah, so in FISMA, those dollar thresholds are set based on 2011 numbers, but they are adjusted for inflation. And so the initial, that was the idea, was that in 2011, when the bill was passed, that was the initial number was based on 2011 rates, but that they are adjusted for inflation. So if, for example, the $25,000 de minimis, the very, very small exemption, or the $500,000 threshold for direct marketing, those numbers are already larger than they were at the time the law was passed.
Thank you. And then I have another question similar, is that will that list of exempt produce be subject to change in the future? 5 years ago, nobody was eating, almost nobody was eating raw kale salads. Now everybody and his brother eats raw kale salads. Is there potential for the same thing to happen with, say, pumpkins, if suddenly there's everybody decides that pumpkins are the next health food and we all need to be eating them raw?
Yeah, you bring up a really good point, and this is something, that I think FDA got a lot of flack from people about their list, for that very reason, that if that's a list that then becomes set in stone in the regulations, it has to go through a formal process to be modified. And so it's possible that that list, won't be in the final rule, or maybe it won't be an exhaustive list. And then there will be additional documents that come out afterwards that can be modified as science evolves, or, consumer preference evolves. But I think that I would agree that having a list in the rules of, which produce is in and which produce is out is a little dangerous, just because it doesn't allow for modification as science or understanding evolves. And that's a point that we've raised on a lot of different issues. You could say the same for the water standard. You could say the same for the manure standard, that if you make a regulatory standard and you set it in stone based on the current state of information, what happens, 3, 4, 5, 10 years from now? You have to go through the whole process again. Whereas if you had some sort of process in place that allows you to modify it, that might be a more sensible way to go.
So, Chris, I have a question for you. Let's take Sam's instead.
Let's see. So Sam wants to know, if I was farming today, would I feel that my record keeping as I handled it in the past would pretty much handle the needed information for the new requirements, or would you have had to go through a revision of your record keeping? I would have to go through a revision of my record keeping, because, for example, I didn't keep track of irrigation. That was something that we didn't have a log that we were tracking for on that. I feel like we were probably, I'd say we were maybe about 80% of the way there. I think we were certainly much closer at the time that we went through the gaps audit. By that time, we actually weren't using overhead irrigation out in the fields anymore. We had gone completely to drip because of the product mix and how that had changed. But yeah, we would have had to upgrade the record keeping.
And I have a sort of continuation of that question. For these regulations, for most farmers, not for you, but for most farmers, what do you think, which part will require the most additional attention?
Yeah, I think it is going to be the record keeping. It's going to be having the systems and getting into the habit of doing what almost every other business does, which is keeping records about the activities that you're engaged in. And that's really complicated on a diversified market farm because of all of the different products that we're working with, and really the vertically integrated nature of a market farm, and that we're growing transplants, we've got high tunnels, we've got field production, we've got some crops that are drip irrigated, some crops that are overhead irrigated. Those fields move around from year to year. We have this harvest process, and then we have this post-harvest handling process, and they all tend to be jumbled together. In any rational business model, those would all be run by separate companies. And instead, we've lumped them all under our roofs, and oftentimes in fairly small operations that are being run by seasonal employees with a high degree of turnover. And I think all of that points to the real challenges that are going to exist in terms of in terms of doing that record keeping, because it is another layer. And frankly, the work that Extension has done on this, on record keeping, having to do with either certified organic production or with the gaps, it sucks, and it's not particularly helpful. And I think because it's a lot easier to design models that fit a factory model rather than the sort of break it down, move it around kind of job shop model that we really have in market farming. So I think that is going to be a challenge. It's going to be difficult to be able to get the resources that you need to be able to put that information together.
Either one of you can go ahead and take Tony's question.
Tony, in my opinion, it's not. Okay, in my opinion, no, it's not going to do anything to improve food safety. This has nothing to do with actually having less people get sick. What this has to do with is public perception. So you've had an either or here. Your or was, is it a move by the big guys to take out the little guys with overburdens and record keeping? No, I actually don't think that it is. I think the reality of this is, and the example I always go back to is that in 2006, we had the spinach outbreak, the E. coli outbreak in October of 2006, September, October 2006. That year, there were over 50 billion servings of fresh bag salad mix that were served in this country, or were purchased in this country. And out of all of those that were purchased, there were 276 people that got sick in that outbreak, and there were 3 people who died. That was 2 people who were over the age of 80 and a baby. Okay, so they were immune compromised. The result of that has been that spinach consumption in this country still hasn't risen back to pre-2006 levels. So what you have is a situation where if you have a food safety outbreak, it has such a negative impact on the produce industry that and that's what this is really about. This is about avoiding food safety outbreaks. And the language in the law is very specific. They're talking about public health. They're not talking about individual health. And I think that I do think that you have to look at it from both sides. I mean, the food safety issue is it's crazy. And the fact that people get up in arms about it and think that spinach is not safe to eat still is absolutely crazy. And so was the reaction that we had at the time. But that's also the reality of the world that we live in, is that the 24-hour news cycle would love to grab a hold of anything like that and make it as big and as crazy as they possibly can. And yeah, Tony, traceability and accountability are after the fact rather than actually improving food safety. Because frankly, if you make somebody sick on your farm, you're out of business anyways. So, and shipping adulterated produce always has been illegal, and it will continue to be illegal no matter whether you follow the FISMA or not. So if you ship produce that is contaminated with salmonella, you violated the law, and you are going to lose your operation. And if you're like the Jensen brothers in Colorado with the cantaloupe outbreak, they ended up under house arrest for it. So, I mean, basically the functional equivalent of serving jail time.
And I think just to add on that a little, that some of the hope in what FISMA allows is that in taking a preventive approach, there's more opportunity to do more outreach and education on food safety, and more opportunity to provide technical assistance on food safety. And so, while I can certainly appreciate some of the perspective in terms of what this role is actually going to do or not, I think that trying to look for a silver lining is that with the increased attention, there's also increased support for training and education and technical assistance, which is always very valuable.
The other silver lining that I really see is this opportunity to start to document the processes that you're using on your farm and start to actually gather data around them. I mean, that's why businesses collect data, and you can get so much more out of it. I go back to what I said about the record keeping in the beginning, that you can use it as an additional management tool. It's an opportunity for you to step back not just to be looking for animal intrusion, but actually to be going out and making sure that you visit each one of your fields each week with the intention of observing and actually engaging in the management process, which oftentimes is something that growers aren't doing. The same thing is true of being able to incorporate the accountability pieces into your record keeping that they're ancillary to what you need to be recording, but it's an opportunity to say, how can I get more out of the requirement that this paperwork that this rule is imposing on me? And yes, Julie, I think you're right. We could end up with some good data on water quality issues.
I agree with that. Chris and Sophia, do you have any final thoughts?
Well, I would just, again, thank everyone for taking the time to stay engaged on this issue. Like I said, it really was having voices from farmers and farmer organizations and consumers and, organizations that work on local food access. That was really what helped us see this turning point in FDA's thinking on a lot of the pieces of this rule. And so I just encourage you to stay connected, whether it's because you want to know what you need to do about your farm, or because you want to be part of this policymaking process. And my contact information is there, and I welcome you to be in touch if you have any follow-up questions. And thanks again.
Chris?
And I mean, my only closing comment is just to say, once again, what fantastic work INSAC really did on this, and how much of the credit that they really deserve for making information about this rule accessible to the broader community in a way that nobody else was doing. And so just thumbs up and send them a check.
All right, great thing to end on. Send the money. Thank you both for an outstanding Farminar, and we will archive this on the PFI website, and I think it'll get a lot of views there. I'll probably listen to it again later, because I learned a lot tonight. So thank you very much. And from Steve and Liz in the Practical Farmers of Iowa office in Ames, that's the Farminar season. Thank you very much.
Thank you.